Nicaragua, officially the Republic of Nicaragua, is the largest country in the Central American Isthmus. The population of Nicaragua is slightly over 6 million. Nicaragua's capital, Managua, is the third largest city in Central America. The multi-ethnic population includes indigenous peoples, Europeans, Africans, Asians, and people of Middle Eastern origin. The main language is Spanish. Native tribes on the eastern coast speak their own languages. The Spanish Empire conquered the region in the 16th century. Nicaragua gained independence from Spain in 1821. Since its independence, Nicaragua has undergone periods of political unrest, dictatorship, and fiscal crisis, the most notable causes that led to the Nicaraguan Revolution of the 1960s and 1970s. Nicaragua is a representative democratic republic. The mixture of cultural traditions has generated substantial diversity in art and literature, particularly the latter given the literary contributions of Nicaraguan poets and writers, including Rubén Darío, Pablo Antonio Cuadra and Ernesto Cardenal. The biological diversity, warm tropical climate and active volcanoes make Nicaragua an increasingly popular tourist destination. Etymology. The name, Nicaragua, was coined by Spanish colonists based on the name of Nicarayo, chief of the most populous indigenous tribe. When Spaniard Gil González de Villa came to Nicaragua in 1521, he found in the areas between Rivas and San Jorge the first pre-Columbian Indians of Nicaragua. At the time, the Indian city was called Coacapulcar and the Cacique leader's name was Maquilnequistli, not Nicarayo. The Spanish name incorporates the indigenous words Nicalnahuac or Nicatlnahuac, which means, here at the lake, or Nicanahuac, here the Anahuac, or the Anihuac from here. History. Pre-Columbian history. In pre-Columbian times, in what is now known as Nicaragua, the indigenous people were part of the intermediate area between the Mesoamerican and Andean cultural regions, and within the influence of the Istmo-Colombian area. The Pipil migrated to Nicaragua from central Mexico after 500 BC, at the end of the 15th century. Western Nicaragua was inhabited by several indigenous peoples related by culture to the Mesoamerican civilizations of the Aztec and Maya, and by language to the Mesoamerican linguistic area. Meanwhile, the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua was inhabited by other peoples, mostly Chibcha language groups. They had coalesced in Central America and migrated also to present-day northern Colombia and nearby areas. They lived a life based primarily on hunting and gathering. Spanish era. In 1502, Christopher Columbus became the first European known to have reached what is now Nicaragua as he sailed southeast toward the Isthmus of Panama. On his fourth voyage, Columbus explored the Mosquito Coast on the Atlantic side of Nicaragua. The Spanish then returned to the western part of what became known as Nicaragua and encountered the three most populous indigenous tribes of people in the land. The tribe led by Nicaragua, the indigenous chieftain Nicaragua is truly named after, but was erroneously thought to be Nicarayo, the chief of another group of indigenous peoples, and Darayangan, the chieftain of a group of indigenous peoples living in central Nicaragua. The Spanish attempted to convert all three tribes to Christianity, Nicaragua and Nicarayo, and the people converted, but Darayangan, however, did not, and was openly hostile to the Spaniards. The first attempt to conquer what is now known as Nicaragua was by Gil González de Villa, who arrived in Panama in January 1520. After exploring and gathering gold in the fertile western valleys, González was attacked by the indigenous people, some of whom were commanded by Nicarayo, and an estimated 3,000 led by the chief Darayangan. The first Spanish permanent settlements were founded in 1524. Conquistador Francisco Hernández de Córdoba founded two of Nicaragua's principal towns in 1524. Granada on Lake Nicaragua was the first settlement, followed by León at a location west of Lake Managua. Córdoba soon built defenses for the cities and fought against incursions by other conquistadors. Córdoba was later publicly beheaded following a power struggle with Pedro Arias de Villa. His tomb and remains were discovered in 2000 in the ruins of León Viejo. The clashes among Spanish forces did not impede their destruction of the indigenous people and their culture. The series of battles came to be known as the War of the Captains. Pedro Arias de Villa was a winner. Although he had lost control of Panama, he moved to Nicaragua and successfully established his base in León. Through adroit diplomatic machinations, he became the first governor of the colony. Without women in the parties, the Spanish conquerors took Nicaragua and Corotega wives and partners, beginning the multi-ethnic mix of native and European stock now known as mestizo, which constitutes the great majority of the population in western Nicaragua. Many indigenous people died as a result of new infectious diseases, compounded by neglect by the Spaniards, who controlled their subsistence. In 1610, the Momotombo volcano erupted, destroying the capital. It was rebuilt northwest of what is now known as the ruins of Old León. During the American Revolutionary War, Central America was subject to conflict between Britain and Spain. Horatio Nelson led expeditions against San Fernando de Romoa in 1779 and San Juan in 1780. Which had temporary success before being abandoned due to disease. Independence. The Captaincy General of Guatemala was dissolved in September 1821 with the Act of Independence of Central America, and Nicaragua soon became part of the First Mexican Empire. After the monarchy of the First Mexican Empire was overthrown in 1823, Nicaragua joined the newly formed United Provinces of Central America, which was later renamed as the Federal Republic of Central America. Nicaragua finally became an independent republic in 1838. Rivalry between the liberal elite of León and the conservative elite of Granada characterized the early years of independence and often degenerated into civil war, particularly during the 1840s and 1850s. Invited by the liberals in 1855 to join their struggle against the conservatives, Costa Rica, Honduras, and other Central American countries united to drive Walker out of Nicaragua in 1857, after which a period of 3 decades of conservative rule ensued. Great Britain, which had claimed the Mosquito Coast as a protectorate since 1655, delegated the area to Honduras in 1859 before transferring it to Nicaragua in 1860. The Mosquito Coast remained an autonomous area until 1894. José Santos Zelaya, president of Nicaragua from 1893 to 1909, negotiated the annexation of the Mosquito Coast to the rest of Nicaragua. In his honor, the region was named Zelaya Department. Throughout the late 19th century, the United States and several European powers considered a scheme to build a canal across Nicaragua, linking the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic. United States intervention. In 1909, the United States provided political support to conservative-led forces rebelling against President Zelaya. On November 18, 1909, U.S. warships were sent to the area after 500 revolutionaries were executed by order of Zelaya. Zelaya resigned later that year. In August 1912, the president of Nicaragua, Adolfo Diaz, requested the Secretary of War, General Luis Mena, resign for fear he was leading an insurrection. Mena fled Managua with his brother, the chief of police of Managua, to start an insurrection. When the U.S. legation asked President Diaz to ensure the safety of American citizens and property during the insurrection, he replied he could not, and asked the United States to intervene in the conflict. United States Marines occupied Nicaragua from 1912 to 1933, except for a 9-month period beginning in 1925. In 1914, the Bryan Chamorro Treaty was signed, giving the U.S. control over the proposed canal, as well as leases for potential canal defenses. Following the evacuation of U.S. Marines, another violent conflict between liberals and conservatives took place in 1926, which resulted in the return of U.S. Marines. From 1927 until 1933, Gen. Augusto C. Acute S.A.R. Sandino led a sustained guerrilla war first against the conservative regime and subsequently against the U.S. Marines, whom he fought for over 5 years. When the Americans left in 1933, they set up the Guardia Nacional, a combined military and police force trained and equipped by the Americans and designed to be loyal to U.S. interests. After the U.S. Marines withdrew from Nicaragua in January 1933, Sandino and the newly elected Sáquezar government reached an agreement by which he would cease his guerrilla activities in return for amnesty, a grant of land for an agricultural colony, and retention of an armed band of 100 men for a year. However, due to a growing hostility between Sandino and Somoza and a fear of armed opposition from Sandino, Somoza decided to order his assassination. Sandino was invited by President Juan Bautista Sáquezar to have dinner and sign a peace treaty at the presidential house in Managua. After leaving the presidential house, Sandino's car was stopped by soldiers of the National Guard and they kidnapped him. Later, Sandino was assassinated that same night, on February 21, 1934, by soldiers of the National Guard. Hundreds of men, women, and children from Sandino's agricultural colony were executed later. Somoza dynasty Nicaragua has experienced several military dictatorships, the longest being the hereditary dictatorship of the Somoza family, who ruled for 43 years during the 20th century. The Somoza family came to power as part of a U.S.-engineered pact in 1927 that stipulated the formation of the Guardia Nacional to replace the Marines who had long reigned in the country. Somoza slowly eliminated officers in the National Guard who might have stood in his way, and then deposed Sáquezar and became president on January 1, 1937, in a rigged election. Nicaragua declared war on Germany on December 8, 1941. During World War II, no soldiers were sent to the war, but Somoza did seize the occasion to confiscate properties held by German Nicaraguan residents. In 1945, Nicaragua was among the first countries to ratify the United Nations Charter. On September 21, 1956, Somoza was shot by Rigoberto López Pérez, a 27-year-old liberal Nicaraguan poet. Luis Somoza Debayle, the eldest son of the late dictator, was appointed president by the Congress and officially took charge of the country. He is remembered by some for being moderate, but was in power only for a few years and then died of a heart attack. His successor as president was René Chic Gutierrez, whom most Nicaraguans viewed as nothing more than a puppet of the Somozas. The Somoza family was among a few families or groups of influential firms which reaped most of the benefits of the country's growth from the 1950s to the 1970s. When Anastasio Somoza Debayle was deposed by the Sandinistas in 1979, the family's worth was estimated to be between $500 million and $1.5 billion. A 1972 earthquake destroyed nearly 90% of Managua, creating major losses. Instead of helping to rebuild Managua, Somoza siphoned off relief money. The mishandling of relief money also prompted Pittsburgh Pirates star Roberto Clemente to personally fly to Managua on December 31, 1972. But he died en route in an airplane accident. Even the economic elite were reluctant to support Somoza, as he had acquired monopolies in industries that were key to rebuilding the nation. Nicaraguan Revolution in 1961, Carlos Fonseca turned back to the historical figure of Sandino, and along with two others, founded the Sandinista National Liberation Front. After the 1972 earthquake and Somoza's apparent corruption, the ranks of the Sandinistas were flooded with young disaffected Nicaraguans who no longer had anything to lose. In December 1974, a group of the FSLN, in an attempt to kidnap U.S. Ambassador Turner Shelton, held some Managua partygoers hostage, until the Somozan government met their demands for a large ransom and free transport to Cuba. Somoza granted this, then subsequently sent his National Guard out into the countryside to look for the perpetrators of the kidnapping, described by opponents of the kidnapping as terrorists. On January 10, 1978, Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, the editor of the national newspaper La Prensa, an ardent opponent of Somoza, was assassinated. It is alleged that the planners and perpetrators of the murder were at the highest echelons of the Somoza regime. The Sandinistas took power in July 1979. The Carter administration decided to work with the new government, while attaching a provision for aid forfeiture if it was found to be assisting insurgencies in neighboring countries. Somoza fled the country and eventually ended up in Paraguay, where he was assassinated in September 1980, allegedly by members of the Argentinian Revolutionary Workers' Party. In 1980, the Carter administration provided $60 million in aid to Nicaragua under the Sandinistas, but the aid was suspended when it obtained evidence of Nicaraguan shipment of arms to El Salvadoran rebels. In response to the coming to power of the Sandinistas, various rebel groups collectively known as the Contras were formed to oppose the new government. The Reagan administration authorized the CIA to help the Contra rebels with funding, armaments, and training. The Contras operated out of camps in the neighboring countries of Honduras to the north and Costa Rica to the south. They engaged in a systematic campaign of terror amongst the rural Nicaraguan population to disrupt the social reform projects of the Sandinistas. Several historians have criticized the Contra campaign and the Reagan administration's support for it, citing the brutality and numerous human rights violations of the Contras. Laramie and Polakov, for example, described the destruction of health centers, schools, and cooperatives at the hands of the rebels, and others have contended that murder, rape, and torture occurred on a large scale in Contra-dominated areas. The Contras also carried out a campaign of economic sabotage, and disrupted shipping by planting underwater mines in Nicaragua's port of Corinto, an action condemned by the International Court of Justice as illegal. The U.S. also sought to place economic pressure on the Sandinistas, and the Reagan administration imposed a full trade embargo. The Sandinistas were also accused of human rights abuses. The Sandinistas won the Nicaraguan general elections of 1984, which were judged to have been free and fair. The Reagan administration criticized the elections as a sham based on the charge that Arturo Cruz, the candidate nominated by the Coordinadora Democrática Nicaraguense, comprising three right-wing political parties, did not participate in the elections. However, the administration privately argued against Cruz's participation for fear his involvement would legitimize the elections, and thus weaken the case for American aid to the Contras. According to Martin Creeler, the results of the election were rigged. After the U.S. Congress prohibited federal funding of the Contras in 1983, the Reagan administration continued to back them by covertly selling arms to Iran and channeling the proceeds to the Contras. The International Court of Justice, in regard to the case of Nicaragua v. United States in 1984, found the United States of America was under an obligation to make reparation to the Republic of Nicaragua for all injury caused to Nicaragua by certain breaches of obligations under customary international law and treaty law committed by the United States of America. During the war between the Contras and the Sandinistas, 30,000 people were killed. Post-war, in the Nicaraguan general election, 1990, a coalition of anti-Sandinista parties led by Violeta Chamorro, the widow of Pedro Joaquin Chamorro Cardinal, defeated the Sandinistas. The defeat shocked the Sandinistas, who had expected to win. Commentators such as Noam Chomsky and Brian Wilson attributed the outcome to the U.S. Contra threats to continue the war if the Sandinistas retained power, the general war weariness of the Nicaraguan population, and the abysmal Nicaraguan economic situation. Exit polls of Nicaraguans reported Chamorro's victory over Ortega was achieved with a 55% majority. Violeta Chamorro was the first female president of Nicaragua. Ortega vowed he would govern desde abajo. Chamorro came to office with an economy in ruins, primarily because of the financial and social costs of the Contra war with the Sandinista-led government. In the next election, the Nicaraguan general election, 1996, Daniel Ortega and the Sandinistas of the FSLN were defeated again, this time by Arnoldo Ailman of the Constitutional Liberal Party. In the 2001 elections, the PLC again defeated the FSLN, with Ailman's vice president Enrique Bolaños succeeding him as president. Subsequently, however, Ailman was convicted and sentenced in 2003 to 20 years in prison for embezzlement, money laundering, and corruption. Liberal and Sandinista parliament members subsequently combined to strip the presidential powers of President Bolaños and his ministers, calling for his resignation and threatening impeachment. The Sandinistas said they no longer supported Bolaños after U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell told Bolaños to keep his distance from the FSLN. This slow-motion coup d'état was averted partially by pressure from the Central American presidents, who vowed not to recognize any movement that removed Bolaños. The US, the OAS, and the European Union also opposed the action. Before the general elections on November 5, 2006, the National Assembly passed a bill further restricting abortion in Nicaragua. As a result, Nicaragua is one of 5 countries in the world where abortion is illegal with no exceptions. Legislative and presidential elections took place on November 5, 2006. Daniel Ortega returned to the presidency with 37.99% of the vote. This percentage was enough to win the presidency outright, because of a change in electoral law which lowered the percentage requiring a runoff election from 45% to 35%. Nicaragua's 2011 general election resulted in re-election of Daniel Ortega, with a landslide victory and 62.46% of the vote. In 2014, the National Assembly approved changes to the Constitution allowing Daniel Ortega to run for a third successive term.